If I told you that major things happened in 2005 that affected modern day fandom as we know it, which things would you guess? I was looking at this because there are actually a number of media things that are having their 20-year anniversary this year. And when I realized how many things had happened in 2005, it felt like actually this sort of flashpoint in fandom as we know it. This has probably given you enough time to drop your guesses in the comments, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you what those things are. In 2005, the very first Percy Jackson and the Olympians novel, The Lightning Thief, was published. The very first Twilight novel was published. The very first episode of Supernatural aired. The very first episode of the modern-day Doctor Who reboot aired, which to really realize and put into focus that all of those things happened in a single year, and that all of those things are turning 20 years old this year, is kind of mind-blowing. And I think something that's so interesting about that is that all of those fandoms are still actively going on right now. Percy Jackson and the Olympians not only published their first book in 2005, but books are literally still being published in that universe right now. There's a massive Disney Plus television show going on, and of course we shouldn't forget that we're also kind of having a Logan Lerman renaissance right now, which I think is important. And then of course there's Supernatural, which was one of the longest running television shows with 15 seasons, which not only had a spin-off, but also still manages to maintain large fan conventions every year. And then of course there's Twilight, which not only completely defined a generation starting in 2005, but also birthed one of the most intense blockbuster series ever. Plus we have Doctor Who, which as we know turns into this massive thing that changes the way British television is consumed globally, and especially in the US. It also changes the way that the BBC makes television and how much money gets put into it. And I think it's no mistake that these four pieces of media not only had such a massive amount of success, but also are being returned to. Obviously, some of these never left. Doctor Who is still running and has managed to reinvent itself a number of times, but Percy Jackson is having a huge explosion with a TV show that actually really fits the original source material, and Twilight is coming back with a television show based on Midnight Sun. Plus, there are so many things that came out of all of these pieces of media. With 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight, that was one of the first times we ever saw fanfiction so publicly marketed, published, and turned into movies as well, which has very much affected the publishing industry. And the list kind of goes on and on. And I think it's really interesting that 2005 turns into this year that ultimately 20 years later has completely changed media as a whole. And I'm curious for you, what is your favorite kind of ripple effect that comes from one of these pieces of media and this moment in time? Whether you were actively consuming media in 2005, or if you kind of jumped on this train as it continued to run for all of these years later, which piece actually stood out for you? And what do you think is the biggest effect on media that the year 2005 and these pieces of media had?